Okay.
I'll just sit here. I don't know what I can do if things go wrong, but I'll just sit here and thumbs up. Yeah, okay.
Hello. Hi, everyone. As it is 11:15, Tim didn't really like tardiness, so I think we'll get moving on this. I'm Guy Bowden. I'm Tim's son, one of Tim's sons. Just for the rundown, we've got a few speakers today covering various aspects of Tim's life. There's food. Please help yourselves to food. The bar's open. You've all found coffee and tea, etc. Please feel free to move around if you need to. The speeches will go for an hour, maybe an hour and a half, broken up with a few musical little interludes and videos and stuff. So I wasn't nervous until just right now, so bear with me. I'm a creature of habit, so I've carefully scripted my speech. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of my brother Barnaby, Tim's brothers Nick and Philip, and our respective families, I welcome you all today to Norths, which sits on the lands of the Gamaragal people, to celebrate the life of Tim Bowden. Before I talk about Dad, I would like to mention his wife and my mum, Ros Bowden, who died in February 2023. She and Dad were married for 55 years. She was an achiever in her own right and the strongest supporter of Tim in his endeavours, both personal and professional. I have no doubt Dad would insist on crediting Mum as the person who enabled his career and family life to flourish so successfully as it did. Tim was Barn and my father. He was also a journalist, social historian, broadcast and writer. The little yellow notebook and pen was always at the ready in his breast pocket. He liked to describe himself summarily and with a degree of delight as a multi-mediocre personality. I enjoyed this description, not only for its wit, but because it reminded me that Dad didn't always take himself seriously. Dad was also a semi-professional part-time ukulelist and liked nothing better than entertaining us and anyone he met, and later his grandchildren, strumming his ukulele and singing hilarious, often nonsensical ditties. He also possessed the useless but amusing skill of playing Happy Birthday on his teeth, in tune, and he would do so at every opportunity. The kids loved it. It was always funny because it was always ridiculous. Okay, one moment. Photo. It was always ridiculous. So funny. His love of comedy is something which sits firmly at the forefront of my mind when I think of him. My earliest and strongest memories of what Dad made Dad laugh the most. More than a few times I felt fearful for his health as he roared with laughter, cackled, spluttered, choked, and sometimes cried whilst watching Faulty Towers. Any episode could have been responsible for his demise, but he would always recover and we would enjoy them again and again and again. The Goon Show was another comedic experience he continued to enjoy decades after he'd first heard the skits and songs. Dad also really connected with the musings of Tom Lehrer. Tom and Tim were about the same age, supremely witty, pithy and topical. They were so well aligned in many ways. The Vatican Rag was Dad's favourite Lehrer song, and he played it for all who hadn't heard it all of his life. I know he would have been keen for any poor soul unfamiliar with Tom Lehrer to hear it, so I thought I would play it for you now. Hopefully this works. Come on. Oop.
Another big news story of the year concerned the Ecumenical Council in Rome, known as Vatican II. Among the things they did, in an attempt to make the church more commercial, was to widen somewhat the range of music permissible in the liturgy. But I feel what they ought to do is to redo some of the liturgical music in popular song forms. I have a modest example here. It's called the Vatican Rag. First you get down on your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Do whatever steps you want if you have cleared them with the pontiff. Everybody say his own Kyrie eleison, doing the Vatican Rag. Get in line in that processional, step into that small confessional. They're the guy who's got religion'll tell you if your sin's original. If it is, try playing it safer. Drink the wine and chew the wafer. 2, 4, 6, 8. Time to transubstantiate. So get down upon your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Make a cross on your abdomen. When in Rome, do like a Roman. Ave Maria, gee, it's good to see you. Getting ecstatic and sort of dramatic and doing the Vatican Rag.
It worked. Dad was a lover of any literature. He always took the time to read to us when we were kids. The most vivid memory I have of Dad is when he recorded himself reading Roald Dahl's The Twits to me and Benoit, Dad's cousin Jonathan's profoundly disabled son. John and Benoit lived in Tasmania, so the recording, once completed, was sent in the post to them. Dad would read a chapter or two each night, doing the different voices for the different characters. This was done, no doubt, at the end of a long working day, and Dad would sometimes mix up which voice belonged to which character. And his precious larynx would have suffered during that week. Some 30 years later, when I played the recording to our children, did I really appreciate its charm and authenticity. I'd like to play an excerpt from that now.
Hello, Joe and Benoit. This is Tim and Guy, and we've got a funny book, haven't we, Guy?
Yep,
What's it called, Guy?
the Twits.
As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours, Guy, but not like mine, simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. What?
Like yours, Dad.
Ah. You'd see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, minced chicken livers, and all the other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. You're plotting something. You're plotting something. Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something. Oh, do shut up, you old hag, Mr. Twit said.
Can we have
No, we'll wait for that tomorrow night, okay?
this, Daddy?
The wormy spaghetti tomorrow night.
Do you want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?
Why? He said.
Because it was
Worms! Cried Mrs. Twit, and rocking with horrible laughter.
Can we have the other one?
They're always doing mean things to each other, aren't they, those two?
Yep.
He dropped his beer, he looked up, a few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, I'll get you for this. Perhaps you could turn the pages over for me. I'll get you next time, you filthy, feathery frumps. I'll wring your necks. I'll wring your necks up. The whole lot of you can have you bubbling in the pot for bird pie before this day's out. Anyway,
Can we have
You say good night and we'll have that.
Bye, Dad.
Well, I think this might be too long. Yeah, no, I'll have that tomorrow. Good
No,
night.
but it's the last chapter.
Actually, we're wasting tape, so good night, Ben. And here we are again. Guy Bowden being read a story to by
Him.
the greatest reader of stories in the world.
No.
Off we go. It's all your fault. You old Mr. Twit thrashing his legs in the air. You're the one, you ugly cow, who went hopping around shouting, we're upside down, we're upside down.
And you're the one who said to stand on their heads, so we better right way up, you whiskery old warthog.
And that is the end of the Twits.
Okay. I always knew Dad loved music, performing or listening. Barnaby and I enjoyed a varied musical upbringing provided by Dad. Pop music, the Beatles. Rock, the Beatles. Folk, Ted Egan. But all forms of classical and opera were Dad's true love. I remember we all sat down one Saturday night to watch The Three Tenors on the ABC. Pavarotti sung Nessun Dorma. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I saw Dad's eyes glistening, and I could hardly see him through my own tears. Dad devoted a great chunk of his life to his favourite composer, Johann Sebastian Bach. He has, over decades, collected every single version of every single cantata ever recorded, whether it was the incredible Berlin Philharmonic playing at the concert hall or the Lane Cove Youth Orchestra at the Chatswood Civic Centre. He loved to share his music, and there isn't a person here who hasn't been the beneficiary of a Tim Bowden branded CD or DVD compilation of some sort. I've heard many accounts over the last month of all the amazing work that Tim did. He was a prolific creator, but in the 70s and 80s, he was just Dad. He was a great provider, and Barn and I had an amazing childhood. While we travelled overseas a bit, we travelled extensively throughout Australia. Tim and Roz took us out of school and we drove around the country for months at a time in an old 1960-something VW combi van called Green Gertie, in the days before automobile comforts like power steering and air conditioning. We would drive through blistering Central Australia. We'd pull over and collect every smelly, sketchy-looking hitchhiker we came across. Then Dad would spy a suitable gravel pit and we would stop and have spam sandwiches for lunch, while Mum or Dad would pull out the tape recorder and interview whoever it was we had collected that day for their documentaries for the ABC Social History Unit. Dad taught me many things, and in particular, the importance of a strong work ethic. He was forever locked away in his study with his reel-to-reel tape deck, cutting and splicing the radio documentaries that he became so well known for. While Mum was definitely the more practical of the two, Dad did throw himself into various DIY projects around the house at Northbridge, and he taught Barn and I some real-world skills. He taught us how to catch a fish, either by line or spear. He taught us how to clean one too. He taught us how to cut wood, set and light a fire to cook that fish over charcoal. He taught us how to play pool and row a boat, change a tyre and back a trailer. Later on, and very importantly, he taught me how to make the perfect gin and tonic. Having terrible hearing, if one works in broadcast, is far from ideal. While Dad was a young cadet in the mid-50s, he suffered significant high-frequency hearing loss during weapons training. Dad marched on for decades, mishearing song lyrics and sometimes misinterpreting vital navigation information until the disability manifested into a volatile situation. I was about 13 and Mum and Dad were driving off to a party one evening and I called out something along the lines of, "Goodbye, have a good time." The car came to a shuddering halt and Dad leapt out, screaming, "What did you say to me?" He thought I'd told him to go and get rooted. Mum moved in quickly to explain that he just said have a good time. So after Dad got his first set of hearing aids, he had a better time of it. He was Mr. Backchat by then and enjoyed heavily discounted hearing aids for many years. He marvelled over the technology and was very particularly smug during summer times when he could, with a flick of a switch, delete the thrum of the cicadas. Meal times were always interesting with Dad. In the years after he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, he lost a lot of weight, but then would obsess over the 16-hour fast. While visiting Woodhenge at Christmas time, we would abide by the strict schedule. Whilst on the beach, we would keep an eye on the time, then drag our confused children off the sand to dutifully return, to find the table set, Rosie swiftly cutting homegrown cucumbers and tomatoes, with bread rolls toasting in the oven, and Dad, pale and clammy, swaying side to side near the kitchen, watching and muttering about ham and soy chicken and English mustard and mayonnaise. Once the food hit the table, Dad would pop the champagne cork and then launch the empty bottle over his head to sail down onto the lawn below. Before the bottle landed, he was tucking in. His blood sugars by now were probably dangerously low, and he would ravenously grab at all foods, oblivious to anyone else's wants or needs, usually tucking in before most others had an adequate plateful. Sometimes, much to our embarrassment, a local contract lawnmower team would fire up the mowers and blowers over the road at this most crucial time of day. Instead of switching his hearing aids to cicada mode, Dad would halt, harumph and bluster, and approach the burly, sweaty men. They probably hoped he was suggesting they come up and shade themselves on the deck and have a nice cold beer on such a hot day. Instead, he demanded they stop the noise of, "We've just sat down for lunch up there." We didn't need hearing aids to get the gist of their response. Now, the irony that this celebration is being held at the old North Sydney Leagues Club is not lost on me. The club happens to be within eyesight of the house where Barn and I grew up in Northbridge. Tim was a fully paid up card-carrying member of the AFL, the Anti-Football League, the real AFL. Dad told everyone who would listen, and plenty who didn't want to hear, all about this cherished organisation, oblivious to the fact he was insulting an Australian institution. He even wrote an article about this organisation for the ABC in 2009. One awkward instance haunts me. During my lengthy stay in hospital in 2001, Tim and Ros visited me, and while Ros was asking the neurosurgeon about my condition, Dad approached a well-built youngster about my age in the bed next to mine who was clearly in a great amount of discomfort. After introducing himself and inquiring about the injury, Tim learned of the badly broken leg that happened during his rugby union game that morning. Tim proudly announced that he was a member of the AFL and that he prefers to call it footbrawl and thugby. Words were exchanged and the curtain between us was mercifully pulled firmly across by Mum. It was devastating. Dad was a big advocate of technology, and in particular, Apple Macintosh, as it was known back in the day. He has been somewhat of a tech guru to some of his friends, somewhat of a cyber bully to others, over his insistence that the latest software upgrade it needed doing or whatever it was he had researched and now was foisting upon people. He always had to have the latest and best machine as it hit the market. He was frugal with other things, though terrible at handling money and anything to do with maths, often doing simple sums on his fingers. He loved a bargain, especially one to do with alcohol. He would proudly tell people after pouring them a glass at how little he had paid for the wine. One Christmas day, you laugh, one Christmas day, it was very much like a scene from The Castle. Dad cheered, "Grandad goes pop!" and off flew the cork off the balcony down to his 3 waiting grandkids on the grass to catch. We grown-ups had a sip, and Dad could not help himself. "What do you reckon?" And before anyone could respond, "Pretty good, isn't it? I got it for $4 a bottle." On Christmas Day, some people might stretch the budget and spend $25 a bottle. Some might even break it and spend $50. Not my dad, Tim. The apple has indeed fallen very far from the tree, and we will be enjoying the premium selection of Australian wines here today. Please enjoy. I'd like to welcome up Dad's brothers, Nick and Phil, to talk. Thank you. And I'll be back. Thank you.
That's me in the middle. Tim was 9 years old when I was born, a gap caused by the Second World War. Our father's Father John's service with the Australian Imperial Force. It was the start of a progress that John liked to call post-war reconstruction. It was most successful. Philip arrived 18 months after me, and Lisa 3 years after him. Having been an only child for such a long time, Tim was extremely excited about the prospect of having a new brother. So he counted the hours until my arrival from hospital. "When are you going to feed him?" he asked our mother Peg eagerly. 10 o'clock, answered Peg. Babies were fed on a strict 4-hour time schedule then, in those days. "Where are you going to sit?" "Over there on the sofa." Peg was determined to be a modern mother and be open about such things. At 9:55 a.m, Tim dragged over a chair and positioned himself strategically to watch how this breastfeeding progress was done. After examining the process from every available angle, he asked, "What happens if he blows instead of sucks?" I'm having a bit of trouble remembering much about Tim during his school days, as I was only 8 when he finished his high school education at the Hudson School. I do remember his sporting specialities were rowing and long-distance running. He would have nothing to do with any sport that involved a football. He had a very good singing voice. I can remember him playing the part of Frederick in the Pirates' Penzance and Ralph in HMAS Pinafore. I do remember him as a cadet reporter with the Mercury newspaper, when he had to report on a range of activities. One was football, and he once took me to a soccer match at South Hobart. It was the only soccer match I've ever attended, and I think possibly him too. Now, Guy did not mention that Tim actually twice won the AFL, Anti-Football League, Walkley Award. This was awarded to the person who did the least for football in Australia. I was so proud of him for this. Mercury reporters often had to work a shift that was known as the dog watch. I think it was from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. To put the paper to bed. Tim's bedroom was under the house, and it had an outside entrance and a bit of a trek along a garden path to get inside. Philip and I had this great April Fool's Day joke. About 8 a.m. in the morning, one of us would stamp on the floor above his bedroom and shout, "Tim, you want it on the phone. It's Mr. Reddy." Mr. Reddy being the editor of the Mercury. This haggard figure would appear in the kitchen, only to be told, "April Fool." He would take this in good humour and disappear back down the path for another 4 hours of well-earned sleep. It was such a great joke, it worked every time. Tim was a keen bushwalker, in spite of a near-death experience getting lost while walking out of the Tasmania's southwest wilderness area, which I won't go into now. But he was keen to pass this interest on to Philip and me, and this was most successful. I have very fond memories of trips with him to iconic Tasmanian locations like Frenchman's Cap and Lake Rona. I was 17 when he left Tasmania to work overseas. As a parting gift, just before he left, he gave me his car. He was a great correspondent while he was away, and so was Peg. So there was a close family connection during this time. His generosity continued. I remember a large grog order used to turn up at home in time for the Bowden family Christmas celebrations at the family holiday house, Ascalon. If he could not be with us in person, he could be in spirit. Please excuse the pun. He married Ros while he was overseas, and as you would all know, they established themselves in Northbridge. The Bowden family could not believe it when he paid $28,000 for that house. In Hobart, you could buy a very respectable home for 12. Work commitments, speaking engagements, holiday and family celebrations made him a frequent visitor to Tasmania. My children always looked forward to his visits because he always came laden with gifts. I did too, because he always made a generous contribution to my wine cellar. When any Bowden family members ventured north to Sydney, they were always welcome at Northbridge and later Woodhenge. Tim was very proud of his Tasmanian heritage. During speaking engagements, one of his favourite lines was to say he came from the testicle state. He asked his audience to imagine Tasmania dangling down below Victoria, suffusing the mainland with strength and vigour. The punchline was, "What a pity there's only one of them." The Sydney Bowdens often visited Tasmania for family celebrations. Tim organised one for his own 70th birthday. It was held at Ascalon, and it was the largest family gathering ever. I remain for many years in constant contact with Tim, daily or more often, through a joint love of Scrabble. So, the Bowden clan has nothing but the fondest memories of Tim, and from my point of view, I can honestly say he was the best elder brother you could ever have.
Well done, Nick. A few days after Tim had died, accolades were being printed, broadcasted on air and on television, describing Tim, amongst other things, as ABC royalty, great historian and true journalist. I called Guy and asked him if this famous Tim Bowden, journalist, broadcaster and author, was the same Tim Bowden who was my brother and your father. Guy said it was. And so it is Tim in that role as a brother that I would like to speak about today. Tim was born after the Second World War, and the rest of the family, Nick, me and sister Lisa, after. So he was always 10 years young. I was always 10 years younger. For whatever reason, he started school at Farn, which was an all-girls school, and then to the Hudson School in Hobart. A bit like Nick, I have very little recollection of Tim living at home or going to school. He started work as a cadet journalist at the Mercury newspaper in Hobart in 1955, and my recollections of Tim living at home are a bit hazy. But I do recall Peg. Tim only ever referred to his parents as John and Peg, giving him a hard time about sleeping in after working all night, as Nick mentioned. Tim was an extraordinarily generous brother. When Nick and I both left school, well, Nick explained that he gave Tim the keys of his car, and he sent enough money back for me to buy my first second-hand car. He also arranged for an enormous amount of beer to be sent down to Ascalon, our family weekender, for the annual Christmas holidays. It was a great delight for any teenagers at the time. In his last year at school, Tim realised that he could run fast over cross-country distances and won the intra-state mile in a very respectable schoolboy time of 4 minutes 48 seconds. I must have been about 7, but I can remember the event to this day. I bet he wished that his running standard was equivalent to his ability to scuba dive. He had bought a full-length CB wetsuit, which needed 2 people to put it on and take it off, usually resulting in tearing off an arm. But our family had gone to Coles Bay to visit family friends, the Waterworths. David Waterworth had a boat moored off the jetty about 20 metres out, and the mooring buoy had come adrift from the heavy chain and sunk to the bottom. Tim was asked to retrieve it. On went the wetsuit, lead belt, flippers, mast and snorkel, and after at least 7 failed attempts to retrieve at the chain, 10-year-old Helen Waterworth jumped in off the jetty in her Speedos, dived in, and coming up holding the heavy mooring chain in her hand, calling to Tim and asked if this is what he was looking for. In later life, when the editor of the Hutchins School magazine asked Tim to write an article on how good the school was in his day, not surprisingly, Tim wrote the opposite and dumped upon the school from a great height, mainly about the teaching standards. The editor would not print the article, and you would not be surprised to hear that a long letter writing battle went on for years. In 1956, after joining the Mercury, he applied for and was successful in obtaining a Learn to Fly scholarship sponsored by none other than the Mercury newspaper, who was his employer. For various reasons, he did not complete the course, but did manage to fly solo. His sense for adventure extended to walking through the reserve, Lake St Clear to Cradle Mountain, aged 10, with Peg and John, and much later, multiple bushwalks in southwest Tasmania. We've got a couple of stories from Spooling Through, Tim's irreverent memoir, which I loved, and apologise if you already know them. But as a new cadet reporter at the Mercury newspaper, Tim was required to cut the rolls of the stock exchange report from the teleprinter into narrow strips and using clag glue them to copy paper. It was the first time it took longer. It was his first time, and it took longer than it should. The journalist who was instructing him told him to hurry up and to quickly take the report down to the chute. "Where is the chute?" asked Tim. "In the sub-editor's room," was the response. So off Tim went with a roll of clag-sake newspapers. As you can imagine, there was no logical response from any of the sub-editors to Tim's question as to where the chute was, other than, "Where do you think it is, in the shithouse?" But he found it, opened the small metal flap and pushed the roll of wet paper in. There was a large farting sound and some paper spat back at him. Some disappeared into the suction pipe. All the sub-editors had stopped editing at this point. And one asked, "What do you think you are doing?" "Just sending the stock exchange report down to the chute to the printers," Tim replied. "Well, if I were you, I'd go down and see if they are getting it." And as Tim ran down the stairs, he noticed small pieces of paper floating through the air like a ticker tape parade. Tim didn't go any further, but wisely returned to the sub-editor's room and reported that all seemed okay. There wasn't much of a stock exchange report in the Mercury the next morning. While working in London in the early 60s, and obviously with visions of grandeur, Tim applied for a job as radio news editor in Uganda. It was the interview that appealed to me. The 2 distinguished gentlemen from the Colonial Office conducted the interview. One reported to Tim that he had read where he had achieved a Bachelor of Arts at the Tasmanian University and had majored in philosophy and ancient civilization. He then asked Tim if he would describe himself as a logical positivist. Tim responded by asking if they could move on to ancient civilization. "Most certainly. So tell me what these names mean to you," and rattled off 6. Tim answered, "To be perfectly honest, sir, I have never heard of those gentlemen." "Gentlemen, Mr. Bowden? They are places." He did not get the job. Tim was not a practical man and not good with tools, perhaps contrary to what Guy said. Any attempt to make or fix anything usually ended up in disaster. For example, when he and Roz camped in our front lawn at home in Tassie on one of their camping holidays, he was explaining how easy the camper trailer was to pack up and be ready for travel in no time at all. He told me that the kitchen sink and cupboards all turned upside down and folded out of the way. As they were leaving that day, he said he would show me, and I was quite impressed until all the cutlery, plates, glasses, and anything that said to be made of china smashed out onto the floor as he had omitted to engage any of the safety latches or catches on the drawers of the cupboard. Not long ago, all three brothers looked like they might rendezvous in the outback town of Winton. It was not to be. I had to move on, but Nick and Fran waited. Tim and Roz did eventually arrive with Penelope and the manor, but on the back of a rescued tilt tray. Tim's love of the microphone was his passion, and there was no doubt he was good at it. Some say he, at times, may have gone on a bit long. At one celebration at home in Manning Avenue in Hobart, when Tim had the floor, my sister correctly assessed that we all had enough. In mid-sentence, she called out, "Thanks, Tim, that's enough." He had met his match. I was lucky enough to travel to the Antarctic with Tim on the Aurora expedition owned Marinus Fativa. He was a resident historian on the boat. I travelled with other friends and we were paying passengers, albeit in steerage class. His lectures were brilliant and I was in awe of his memory and ability to recall relevant stories to embellish the delivery. As you would expect, he never gave up and we couldn't get away from his take on Scott the Clot. Tim was also an active crew member and assisted with passenger in and out rubber duckies and on heaving gangplanks, duties normally assigned to a much younger man. One story he told to the passengers, not to the passengers, he was an account of being stuck in the pack ice on Aurora Australis for some weeks. With little to do, and I have no doubt Tim was part of this plan, it was to go to the ship's freezer, bring out a pig carcass, dress it up as an expeditioner, strap it into the front seat of a helicopter, radio and fly to the nearest base and report a medical emergency of hypothermia. On all accounts, it did not go down very well. How lucky we are to have Tim's family, as a family, to have a shelf full of his books on a multitude of subjects, including one written about our father's life. If we get a question or from a grandchild on the family's part, we just tell them, read the book. It was possibly Tim's greatest legacy of recording history, and he did what we all think we might do one day. Tim was great to be around. He continually used to quote our father. He could recite poems and lyrics from songs and had a wonderful repertoire of stuff from the Goons and Peter Sellers. He was musically talented and could play the piano by ear and was very handy on the ukulele and, as already mentioned, his teeth. Usually, when departing, would always say, "May your scrotum never cover a banjo." He was a wonderful brother and we loved him very dearly.
Thank you, Nick and Phil. I didn't say he was good at it. I said he gave them a go, the DIY. I'd like to, yes, welcome Emma and Hattie to the stage.
Hello, I'm Harriet Graham and this is Emma Graham. When Guy asked us to share a few thoughts about Tim, it was hard to keep it short. We're going to keep it short, but there is, of course, just so much to say. My first memories of Tim date back to the 1970s in Northbridge, at the Northbridge House at Marana Road that he and Roz had taken over from Beth and Jerry Stone. And I'm sure many here have enjoyed many a happy party there, including Sunday lunches outside, which often were interrupted to listen to one of Tim's latest programs, or loyally he would let us listen to one of his many friends' programs, but they were wonderful days. Over the years, our late parents, Rachel and Jack Graham, became firm friends with the Bowdens, and my sisters Emma and Martha, who's not here, grew extremely fond of Tim and Roz, and their beautiful little boys, Barn and Guy, who's been speaking. Looking back, that Tim could win over three opinionated, sometimes moody teenage feminists particularly after calling his second son Guy in 1975 International Women's Year, was an enormous feat, an absolutely enormous feat. Moody, teenage feminists, but we absolutely loved him. And it was Tim our parents sent to wake us up at 6 a.m. for the early starts of those many, many camping trips, because honestly, who could resist that cheery face, that giggle and that twinkle in his eye? Tim, as you're going to hear, of course, was a man of many, many professional talents. And Emma and I are just going to focus on a couple of what we saw as his personal talents as we knew them. Firstly, and I think everyone here will agree, Tim had an enormous talent for friendship and cheerfulness. All Australia knows how much he loved to get in the van and go to the wilds of Tasmania or the Birdsville track, the the goat races at Lightning Ridge. But if he couldn't make a long trip, he would certainly settle for a weekend camp. Beginning in the 1970s and right through the 80s, we spent countless weekends with the Bowdens and some others here today, like the Skinners, at a piece of land that we owned at Yarramalong. Evenings were special. Ros was, of course, a magnificent cook, but I have a clear vision of Tim bent over, jealously guarding his fire and his camp ovens, dressed in an ancient pair of brown shorts pulled up a bit too high, exposing those delightfully spindly shanks, poking at his fire, prodding his potatoes, probably wearing a sort of slightly grubby cricket hat, tinny in one hand that's probably in a dusty Birdsville track stubby holder, laughing, talking, giggling. Who called the cook a bastard, he'd shout. And he would wait for Dad to call back, as he did every weekend. Who called the bastard a cook?
After dinner on these weekends, we would sing. Tim would get out the ukulele and give us a bit of George Foreman when I'm cleaning windows, maybe one of his great friend Ted Egan's numbers. But there was one that we always begged him to play. He had what we regarded as his trademark song, and no evening was complete without it. It's a song I'll always associate only with Tim. This is the one time in my life when I regret not being able to play the ukulele, but I'll give you a little bit of the song. I've got a clock that wakes me every morning for my train. I've got a corn that gives me warning when it's going to rain. I've got a dream that's coming true. I've got a sweetie in view, 'cause I'm as happy as I can be, 'cause I've fallen in love with a girl, you see. I haven't told her, haven't told me, but we know it just the same. Saturday night on her settee, oh, what a time there's going to be. I haven't told her, haven't told me, but we know it just the same. There's more, but I'll spare you. We saw his talent for simple fun, a bit of a sing-along, a few laughs, a few drinks, admire the stars, talk into the night on those many weekends. And it's not a bad example to follow. In my experience, Tim had the rare quality for a man of his generation of being completely unafraid of looking ridiculous. It didn't scare him. And so he never lost the sparkle of being a small boy with a ukulele, even when he was a grown, indeed, a middle-aged man.
But Tim didn't just have a talent to nurture old friendships. He had the most extraordinary talent to make a new friend, absolutely anywhere. We often travelled with the Bowdens, each in our own van, and sometimes we'd stay by a gravel pit by the side of the road, as the guys already said. But caravan parks were also a fertile ground for Tim in that relentless pursuit for a new second best friend. We would start unloading the vans, but before we were unpacked, Tim would have invited some old coot back that he'd probably met in the amenities block, someone he would have found within 5 minutes, back to our campsite, and he'd settle them in with a tinny, and he'd be talking, and we'd be hearing their amazing stories. Dad used to call these people Tim's old liars, but certainly we heard some amazing stories, and it added an added dimension always. and always a lot of laughs. Tim just loved being on the road, and not much would get in his way. As I said, we often travelled in convoy. The Bowden's up front in that pale green van that Guy's mentioned. But Tim didn't like to break a journey for a trivial reason. And parental flexibility was not always his strong suit. Notwithstanding having young children, he really did think a trip shouldn't be interrupted. And I have a very distinct memory of my parents' horror as we watched from the car behind as Tim held Guy right outside the window for a quick pee, trailing in the wind back onto our windscreen, laughing, and then he pulled Guy back in and we kept going.
As I'm sure we'll hear, Tim loved an adventure, and many of them were described on his radio programs and others he wrote about. When we knew him, he had experience of the world that we didn't have because of his deep love of Southeast Asia. He told us stories of visiting Angkor Wat before it was a tourist attraction, the islands of Vietnam, and the delights of the old Singapore. When Harriet was chosen to go to Bangkok as an exchange student in 1981, it was Tim who reassured our father that it would be a good idea. Dad was very wary of letting her go, and Tim spoke passionately about the prospect of all the adventures she would have. He was right about that. He also introduced her to his Thai friends, to people who'd been close to his good friends Monica and Tony Joyce, and that made a big difference to her trip. He was endlessly encouraging about travel. At a time when many white Australians ate a very bland diet, and God knows we did, Tim was an aficionado of Asian food, the love of which he developed during his time as a correspondent. When I travelled to Asia for the first time in 1982, and I was very, very culture shocked, Tim happened to be in Singapore, and he generously insisted on taking me to the Tang Lin Club, where he'd been a member for years. We dined in style, and Tim ordered the famously hot chili crab, which proved to be too hot even for him, although he kept at it, at least until he managed to put some chili in his eye, and the whole enterprise was abandoned. But even then, he never lost his enthusiasm for spicy food, and it was very kind of him to show a penniless backpacker something of the old Singapore, which at that time was already disappearing. But if he couldn't get somewhere more exotic, a holiday at the beach was good enough, and they came to Crescent Head, our parents' house at Crescent Head, on many, many occasions. I can still see him at Crescent Head cheerfully playing Patience by himself if no one else would play a game with him, or locked in a fierce Scrabble competition with one of the other guests, Greg Woods comes to mind, or playing the dictionary game, which was a favourite, because creating absurd definitions was absolutely up Tim's alley.
So the talent for friendship, cheerfulness, but Tim also had an enormous talent for loyalty. He was so loyal to his friends. He cheered on when they did well, and he stuck by them through hard times. He certainly was a very staunch friend to our parents, sometimes in difficult times, and they stayed close until Mum and Dad died. When Tim and Roz moved to Bluey's, Mum and Dad missed them greatly, but Tim never let any connection drop, and so they kept in touch. Even when both Mum and Rosie were so affected by dementia, he remained kind and caring and kept in touch. We remember Tim so fondly. A couple of teenage feminists grown old. We think of him with great love. He was a unique fellow who enriched our lives and whose cheerfulness and love of life is not forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma and Hattie. Oh, the 80s, eh?
I've got a clock that wakes me every morning for my train. I've got a corn that gives me warning when it's going to rain. I've had a dream that's coming true. I've got a sweetie in view. I'm as happy as I could be, 'cause I've fallen in love with the girl you see. I haven't told her, hasn't told me, but we know it just the same. Saturday night on her city, oh what a time that's going to be. I haven't told her, hasn't told me, but we know it just the same. She still calls me mister, but she won't, I know she won't, after I've kissed her. I've got an idea soon there'll be one little, two little, possibly three. I haven't told her, hasn't told me, but we know it just the same.
I agree with Emma and Hattie in I considered learning the ukulele for today as well, but you know, you run out of time with these things. I'm going to welcome Mike Carlton to the screen here.
Hi, I'm sorry I can't be with you today. It's school holidays and we're off overseas with the 15-year-old son who is filming this for me on an iPhone. So here we go. Tim and I first met in Bangkok in 1966. We were both there as foreign correspondents for the ABC to cover the visit of one Lyndon Baines Johnson. And our mutual friend and Tim's fellow Tasmanian, Neil Davis, actually introduced us. I've never forgotten it. Tim was reclining on his hotel bed, reading from a piece of cheap and nasty pornography that had been urged on him by a taxi driver tout on the way in from the Bangkok airport. Listen to this, dear boys, he said, and I remember the words. The Cardinal watched eagerly as his daughter undressed across the room. It was unforgettable. I have to say, how we laughed. Not that he was into pornography any more than the rest of us, but he was into, I guess you could say he was into the foibles of human nature. He loved the quirks and zaniness of the human condition, rejoicing in human foible. And he would have been just as intrigued if the taxi driver had sold him the Bible or Proust or Jane Austen or something. Odd as it sounds, up there on the foreign correspondence circuit, we call each other, it was a bit private school by the sort of, by the feel of it, we call each other by surnames, not Christian names. So it was Bowden, not Tim, and Carlton, not Mike. His initials were TG, but we never got to discover what the G stood for. He stoutly refused to tell us. But would usually sign, he just said it was God, and would usually sign his ABC nicknames, T God Bowden, which confused him no end back at headquarters. But he was then, in those days, already a seasoned ABC broadcaster for what the ABC called the talks department, in a strange, old-fashioned way. I was a different beastie. I was from the news department. The two departments were locked in a fierce internecine warfare. But we got on fine. We all got on fine. And generously, Tim became a mentor to me. He showed me the ropes. We would run into each other in Saigon, Jakarta, New Delhi, wherever. 12 years older than me. He was the consummate professional. There was no doubt about that. And in the beginning, I was quite in awe of him. Not later, but in the beginning. He had the great qualities of the best broadcast journalist, a fierce curiosity, a passion for accuracy, an acute bullshit antenna, and the ability to turn any story he uncovered into a listenable, entertaining story. He wrote his scripts in taut but stylish prose with a flash of whimsy or humour where he knew it would work. And swiftly too, and always before deadline. And like all of us then, I guess, sadly not now, he'd had voice training so he could speak with clarity in a mellow and attractive voice. There was none of what Clive James called the plonking manner. Radio was his first great love, there was no doubt about that. It had been his nursery where it began. And by the time we met, he was a supreme technician. The tools of his trade were at first a tiny Stellavox tape recorder with 5-inch reels that could only run about 7 minutes. That was about the max. after that upgraded to a giant, heavy, clunky Nagra tape recorder. The ABC engineers and boffins in their wisdom had decided that the cassette tape recorder, small and easy, was merely a passing fad, and that ABC, well, it was good enough for the Americans and the Japanese, the ABC certainly should not use one. Tim was saddled with this monstrous Naga recorder. On the road, he would bash out a script on a typewriter and then record it in a hotel bedroom or a rice paddy field or an airport, sometimes, if he could, with a towel over his head to block out the surrounding Asian noise. And then with a razor blade and some sort of sticky tape, he would splice it all together, the interviews and the sound effect. And God knows how he did it. It was a miracle to watch and something far beyond my pay grade. Yet television he did too, brilliantly so. Back home first, he started as the executive producer of the ABC's PM program, The First, and then switched to TV, where he became a producer on This Day Tonight, the 7:30 PM current affairs show. But in all honesty, I don't think he enjoyed television all that much. Radio is a theatre of the mind, dear boy, he would say, theatre of the mind. And he was right, because he knew it could engage the listener's imagination in a way that television could not. And yet he was good at television. When he fronted that Backchat show for the ABC, listener reaction show, he had a huge audience. It was much loved for him. And it was something suited entirely to his style, the gently arched eyebrow, the quizzical shrug, and the gentle wit endeared him to a whole generation of listeners for whom he was the face and voice of the ABC. And of course, in later life, he took to the printed word, writing a brilliant biography of Neil Davis, who was killed in a coup in Bangkok in 1985. The book, One Crowded Hour, was just lovely. It had a mixture of love, a bittersweet sorrow, and the ultimate celebration of an extraordinary life. And it raced off the shelves, rightly so. Socially, Bowden was always a delight to be. It was just fun over lunch or dinner. The parties he threw with Roz were long and riotous and memorable. And yet behind the joyous, sometimes even frivolous facade, there was indeed a serious purpose. He had a lifelong and passionate commitment to public broadcasting. He believed profoundly in the virtue of public broadcasting, and he was dedicated to its advancement. And in that alone, he left a brilliant and I think indelible mark. We're so lucky to have known him. He was such a good man, such a nice man, such a true man, such an honest man, such a decent man, and our lives were enriched by him. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now, I'm aware that people might be getting hungry. Does anyone want to take a 5-minute break, have something to eat, or should we just power on? Keep going. Okay, there we go. One has spoken. I've got a running sheet here.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
Guy, we might have just a 5-minute break.
5 minute.
Toilet and
Okay,
all that
let's
kind
take
of
a
thing.
5-minute break. Okay,
I think
no
5
worries.
minutes. Yeah.
Hello again, everybody. 5 minutes turns into 15 minutes quite quickly. If I could get you all to, I suppose, prepare for the second chapter of Tim Bowden's Wake. And I'd like to call Robin Williams up to talk about Tim. Thanks, everyone. Sorry to, ruin the vibe. Pressing these buttons. Touch them.
Hello again, we're here. Been to the loo? Had a bit of nosh? I have one question about what you've just been listening to before. Would Tom Lehrer be allowed on air these days? On Radio National? I'll have to ask Jane. Do you realise he's 96? Still going. I remember phoning him up when I wanted to do something naughty on ABC Radio, and you could do something naughty then. And I said, there's an election coming in the United States. Would you care to write a little song to celebrate it or something? And I could broadcast. He said, I'm afraid I've given up. As soon as Henry Kissinger got the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, I realized there's no satire anymore. I have two jobs. One of them, first of all, is to get a message from Berlin, and then a few small thoughts from me. The message from Berlin comes from Ian Cumming, producer and director of Breaking the Ice, a series on television about Antarctica. It's one of the last great journeys left in the world, a sea voyage to Antarctica. Those were Tim's first words in the TV series Breaking the Ice. In 1995, we shared the last great journey together in a tiny cabin on the Aurora Australis, rolling through the Southern Ocean, then bashing through the pack ice to spend a mad few days at each of Australia's Antarctic stations, filming in the most difficult conditions on Earth. The shoot was an exhausting race against time and the elements, and Tim was its champion, ready for the adventure. He abseiled for the first time in his life down an icy cliff face, and through the nervous excitement, exclaimed to the camera, "This is one of the great moments of my life." He was nearly 60 years old at the time. Tim had been to Antarctica before and knew how to loosen the tongues of folk who'd spent a year there in isolation. We brought along dozens of bottles of gin, rum and whiskey to make ourselves welcome. Then, with Tim's charming manner, we gathered wonderful insights into the life and work of Australians in Antarctica. We almost lost Tim when we landed him on top of an iceberg. The chopper flew off to get the shot of him standing alone near the precipice. Only then we saw a giant fissure in the ice, with Tim standing on the wrong side of it. Fortunately, word never got back to the ABC's risk management department. There were plenty of arguments about what to film and how to do it. The camera and Nagra, you've heard about the Nagra batteries, would die from the cold, usually in the middle of an interview. Tim handled it all with the utmost professionalism and good humor. When language was a barrier, Tim had the solution. We visited a Chinese Antarctic station where the leader gave Tim a book about their Antarctic endeavors. In exchange, Tim presented a carton of Winfield Red and a bottle of Johnny Walker, and the ice was broken. When we choppered onto the Ostra penguin rockery, Tim was visibly upset to find thousands of emperor penguin chicks dying of starvation. He cared for the planet and the natural world and pressed to include the impact of overfishing and global warming in our report. Those 2 mad months down south and the months of editing that followed are amongst the fondest memories in my television career. It was a delight to work with a journalist veteran, a man with both an incisive wit and a caring nature. When times were tough down there on the ice, Tim was my rock, always there to back me up. The programs we made were ratings winners, indeed. Breaking the Ice was on repeat over the next decade, a testament to a great storyteller. It was indeed one of the last great journeys. Vale Tim, from Ian Cumming, former executive producer, if you remember, Catalyst. He pioneered it. That's from Berlin. As for me, well, one of my puzzling thoughts going back was how quickly I got to know Tim and other people when I joined the ABC in 1972. Because these days, okay, so we're all in one building, but it's like having a non-stop Zoom meeting, but in person. It has that kind of distance, impersonal nature. And yet then I was getting to know people so quickly. And I was reminded by one of the people here tonight, this afternoon, of something called the Radio Action Movement, RAM. There in a little church off William Street in our diaspora, because there wasn't one great big building, we were spread all over the place. And in fact, television and most of current affairs was way over the other side of the water, Gore Hill. And yet we all got to know each other so quickly. What was going on? How did a village exist so wonderfully then? And as Bob Debus has remarked, how were ideas just flowing so beautifully? And the thing was that we had to do something that was bouncing off a rather static tradition in that point. Because you see, the surprising thing about Tim, even then, right at 1972, 1973, 1974, is he could do everything. You've heard, you know, maybe not tap dancing. He had a wonderful way with having fun. I remember going out on a boat with him when we took our families quite often up the road here on the water. And somewhere around 9:30 or 10 in the morning, Tim would say, "Time for a tinny." "But it's breakfast time, Tim." He said, "Yes, that's why I need a Timmy." But he didn't particularly go overboard, not in my experience. But Tim could do almost anything. And there we were in RAM. The whole point of that organization was not just radio, but television, everything combined. People who were heads of department turned up. People who just joined the ABC like me were there as well. And we exchanged ideas, because ideas were the currency we wanted really to build on, rather than bits and pieces and staid old stuff. And don't forget, at that point, okay, Tim liked technology to some extent, but then if I wanted to edit something, the people who were the technicians, so-called, belonged to the PMG department. They weren't the ABC, so they belonged to the Postmaster General. And you weren't to sit there cutting out ums and ers or anything else, but book something and then wait while we ground through this toil of non-creation, but just smoothing, wasting time. And I really found out dramatically when I first started the science show, 49 years ago, in 1975, I did the first one as it happened in Canada. And I turned up, yes, with my 12-kilo Nagra and even some razor blades and such like, alone. And the CBC people, the executive producer, said, "Where's your team?" I waved at him. And in fact, when he was desperate to get someone who was really a famous superstar whom I just interviewed, I said, "He's in the Hyatt up the road. Borrow my Nagra." Go, "Oh, I can't do that. I've got to wait for my voice man." There was no voice man available. It never happened. What we were doing was really an upheaval, a revolution. And this revolution, of course, brought in dramatic change, which is why in the later 70s, there was huge industrial action featuring, of course, Tim Bowden, and actually my good self. I can't quite remember whether I proposed no confidence in the board or in the managing director, Talbot Duckmanton. But Tim did one and I did the other. And that strike went on for a week. But the interesting thing, as far as I'm concerned, the spirit that Tim brought to it was the kind of open-mindedness and willing to build helpful connections that had Menzies having a whiskey with Chifley way back in Parliament House in the old politics. Imagine that happening now. Poisonous politics going on. We're winning of the tribes. They do the AFL now, yes. But in a political sense, win at all costs. However, what Tim was doing, what I hope we were doing, was trying to build a better ABC. And we did that in lots of ways. I'll just give you two small examples. One of them, when we were all back at work and we moved to Ultimo, I said to Tim, look, Tal, we gave him a hard time, but he was one of us. He was head of the ABC for 18 years. Shall we invite him back for a tour of the ABC? He can either come for a couple of cups of tea, a royal tour, or whatever he fancies. And I wrote to Tal, and he wrote back 2 pages, carefully whited out here and there. And he said, mine was the only contact he'd had from the ABC since he'd had retired in capital letters. And I know the full meaning of the word retirement now. The only contact he'd had, apart from the occasional request for a comment about someone's death from the BBC. And when I talked to his family after he died, they said that contact from us at the ABC saying, come and have a look. Okay, we had a strike, but it's over and we've got a different. That contact was one of the best things in his later life ever, which I think is fantastic. The other thing about Tim is when we had yet another managing director turn up, somebody called Jonathan Shire, we thought he needed to be somehow preempted because he was doing lots of, the first thing he did when he turned up, and this became a tradition, is cancelling the science series on television, Quantum. And he's proud to announce that when there was the international arrival of the various delegates. So I said to Tim, look, you look a bit like Jonathan Shire. You've got 2 legs. You've got handsome hair. And we actually had, on the Dot Strong Terrace, big area like this, Tim pretending to be Jonathan Shire, doing a speech to the entire BBC. And he got away with it. We did it more than once. It was absolutely wonderful. Tom Malombi remembers that, don't you? No, not quite. So there we were. Yes, you've got all sorts of memories that we've touched on. But the inheritance is not only how to build and keep a village, how to have the skills transfused throughout the ABC, not just in limited ways in a restriction like that. And also my own motto, which Tim represented so wonderfully, was leave the building. Go and see what's going on around Australia, around our region. He did do back chat, that was wonderful, that pioneered for Media Watch, of course, although I'd love to see Paul Barry emulate Tim and do it naked. Do you remember when he did naked? There was Tim doing work on ice, doing all sorts of different aspects of radio, television, you name it, and so on. And when he retired and when we lost Roz, I wrote to him one day and said, I haven't had any of those rude emails from you recently. Are you okay? And he absolutely confirmed that he was okay. And he sent me something so rude, I couldn't possibly mention it today. But I will actually show it to you if given an incentive. But my final example of the generosity and wonderful creative spirit of Tim Bowden is when I went actually for the first time way back to Tasmania. He said, you really have to take precautions when you go there. It's very, very cold. And I said, but I grew up in Vienna. I've known cold. He said, no. It's much worse than that. So much so that I've actually asked my mother to knit you a woolly warmer. I said, what? How? Do you know my measurements? He said, yes, she often does tea cozies. And I brought it here today.
Fabulous.
There is my willy warmer, produced by the Bowden family. I haven't quite tried it on yet. Thank you, and Vale too.
Thank you, Robin. I've got Dad's one at home. It's bigger than that. I'd like to welcome Jane Connors to the stage. Thank you, Jane.
I don't think I've ever followed a willy warmer before. I'll do my best. I drew myself to Guy's attention after Tim died, and the wonderful obituaries came out, and they were wonderful, and they drew rightful attention to all of Tim's achievements. But as ever, the radio component of it was not, in my mind, sufficiently prominent. And those of us who worked in radio at the ABC will know we spent most of our lives going, and radio, at every meeting we went to. So I wrote to Guy and said, and radio, you're now being, so this is why I'm here, because I did work with Tim in radio, which was not his only love, but I think his great love. And I met him around 1989, when I was lucky enough that Roz took me in as an intern into the social history unit that she and Tim and others had founded in 85. And it was just after, of course, there'd been that massive upsurge in popular history, in the authentic voices of real Australians for the bicentennial. And Tim and Roz and the other members of the unit were absolutely right in the forefront of it, because they had access to the airwaves and they could broadcast these authentic voices out to hundreds of thousands of people. And Tim, very much in demand at oral history conferences around the country, very much admired for his skills in this area. And first thing I remember really was his office had an enormous glass window, and it should really have been very light, but it was in fact very dark, because the entire window was covered with hundreds and hundreds of strips of black tape, sticky tape to the roof and flowing down the window. It was like a sort of Gothic version of a butcher's fly screen, really, just blowing around and held together. Mike Carlton referred to Tim's capacity to edit, and in those days it was very physical. He'd moved up from an old Nagra to a Lyric, which was just the Rolls Royce of editing machines, and he was just, no one could sort of find a breath like Tim and cut things together and work out which sentence could go with that one and what you could get out of his recordings. And so they were just absolutely bestrewn with little bits of editing tape stuck together, and they had odd chinograph notations which would tell Tim and Tim alone what the hell they were, and where they needed to go and how they had to be put together with the other bits of tape to form one of his very coherent programs. And in a way I didn't see him that often, because he did have that extraordinary work ethic, and he just sat in this dark room for hours and hours every day. But he charged out several times, and he appeared to have always forgotten that the very eminent executive producer, R. Bowden, was actually his boss at work and not so much his wife. And he would come out yelling, "Rosie, what have you done with my lunch?" Or, "Rosie, where did I put my glasses?" Which quite often earned him a very snappy reply, but it added a nice domestic touch to the workplace. Because when Tim had decided that his time in current affairs was over in the second half of the 1970s, he turned to special projects. And special projects in the ABC was usually management code for, we are taking legal advice on how we can force you out, but here's some bullshit work to do in the meantime. But that really was not the case for Tim. His projects actually were special. So because he had such a reputation, he was able to forge his own way and to suggest what he would do in a way that some other people probably didn't have quite the latitude, but very well deserved in his case. So his early oral history series included The Top End, which was about the Northern Territory, and The West Coasters, which was based on interviews with woodcutters and miners on the west coast of Tasmania. And these were really well received when they went out. And in 1979, inspired by the BBC's massive series Tales from the Raj, which had been very popular in Australia, Tim proposed a 24-part series, radio series, on the experiences of Australians who had lived and worked in Papua New Guinea. And working with historian Hank Nelson and colleague Daniel Connell, he collected 350 interviews. So a massive oral history collection. And he condensed and winnowed and massaged their contents down into 24 really interesting parts about Australians and their relationship with PNG. And gave his heart and soul to that project, which was eventually broadcast under the title Time Belong Master, and really spent 1980, 1981 pulling it together, which is when Ros said she felt like a single parent sharing a house with a grumpy lodger the whole time. A feeling I think she probably had more than once in their lives together. But Time Belong Master was amazing. It attracted critical acclaim and a large audience. But Tim and Hank moved on again almost immediately, as in February 1982, as the other series was going out, they joined a pilgrimage back along the Thai-Burma Railway with a group of veterans, former prisoners of war, who had worked on it and had appalling stories to tell about their lives along that railway. And they came back convinced that this was a story that had to be told, and they spent the next 12 months getting ready with really good research. In the 40 years since the war, Australians did know about Changi and the Thai-Burma Railway, but nowhere near enough, because as we know, we had sent a generation of men and women home and told them not to talk about it. So there were thousands, I think they estimated there were about 22,000 still alive, thousands of increasingly elderly men and women who'd been living for decades in reticence and isolation. And I think Tim came along at the right time for them to open up, but I think it had to be Tim. It really had to be Tim, I think, and no one else, because you could hear the trust in these men, particularly as he gently and expertly led them on to open up, and they could trust him with what he would do with their stories. And the stories were so painful. There was laughter at some point about life in the camps and on the railway, but they were really painful, but they were important. And listeners sat and cried when they could hear the cracks in those ageing voices and the trauma in the silences. And that is what Tim loved about radio. I mean, because in a way you didn't see the faces, but you heard everything in the voices. And I just think he did an absolutely brilliant job with that. And the series and the accompanying books were rightly lauded. The original interviews were all archived at the ABC and copies were lodged at the War Memorial. And in my view, they constitute one of the most significant oral history collections in the country. And when I went on to replace succeed Ros as EP of Social History, we were still playing the series POW Australians Under Nippon and other associated programs 12 or more years later during the summer season. And every year I thought, maybe we're overdoing it, maybe we've played it too often and we might get complaints from listeners about it, but we never did. We always had people say that they had heard it before, but they heard more in the series every time. And I heard those programs many, many times, and they got me every time. So on the back of those series, Tim proposed the creation of the Social History Unit, a dedicated unit doing oral history, talking to ordinary people. It had a real politics. It wanted to hear all the voices we hadn't heard from before. And Ros was an enormously important part of that project and had very clear politics around it. So many stories were told by Tim and Ros and colleagues, and younger people came in and broadened perspectives and different diverse voices came in. But it really did constitute a people's history of Australia, and I think it's a very significant legacy for both of them. When Tim retired in the 1990s, I think he had many other things to do, which I think is really why he left. He had books to write, as we know. But he also told me that he was worried about the coming of digital editing, where everything would be done on a computer screen, which brings incredible benefits. And Guy does all his work digitally, and there's so much you can do on a computer. But Tim just couldn't bear the thought of, though not a Luddite, he just couldn't bear the thought of losing that feel of tape and the movement of tape on a tape recorder, and the craft skills involved at running it back and forth through a machine. As it happened, he wildly overestimated the speed of technological change at the ABC, and he could have stayed another 6 or 7 years, or 17 if he'd followed the lead of our most famous actual Luddite, one R. Williams. But he did have other things to do, as we know, and did them with the same charm and wit and energy and diligence. And just to finish, I had an entirely serendipitous encounter with Tim just a few weeks before he died. I was driving back down to Sydney, where I live, from an event in Newcastle, and in the car was another Radio National legend, the film critic Geordie Rigg. And we pulled into just a random servo on the A1 for a random pit stop, and we ran slap bang into Tim, who'd also pulled in at the same time. And we met him in front of that, that stand with the car deodorants and the windscreen wipes, and had a lovely chat, because he always beamed when he saw you, as everyone has said. He was such a sort of friendly, twinkly man. And then suddenly, Philip Adams was there too. This is not a fever dream. This actually happened at 11 in the morning on the A1. So Philip was heading down for his final week on air at the ABC. And the three of them, contemporaries, absolute stalwarts of public broadcasting, stood happily in the sun for about 10 or 15 minutes, just chatting and laughing together. And I will forever kick myself for not taking a photo, but it's just such a lovely image in my mind forever. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. I have Malcolm Robertson to come up to the stage and talk about Dad's trials and tribulations in Antarctica.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you, everyone. My name's Malcolm Robertson, and I wintered at Mawson Station in 1970 as a geophysicist. And I'm sorry I didn't bring my ukulele with me to keep you entertained, but I think we've probably had some good entertainment already. I'm representing a group called the Inari Club. So that's the Association for Friends and Veterans of the Australian National Antarctic Research Expeditions, Inari. Sometimes people call it a NAIR. Could I just start off with a couple of apologies? The first one is from David Dodd, our club president in Melbourne. He would love to have been here, but the budget didn't quite run that far enough. And secondly, from David Pera and Liz Pera-Cook from Albatross Films. Many of you probably know David and Liz from their ABC work in the Natural History Unit. Sadly, Liz is in hospital today having her knee replaced, and David is standing by. The last I heard, he was out buying a stationary bicycle for her. David and I were at university together studying physics, and we both signed up for the 1970 year at Mawson. David was the Inari cosmic ray physicist, but even then his interest was in photography, natural history, and was well established. I thought I might just give you a little anecdote. Tim loved stories. So this is the kind of story that Tim would have found when he was probing around in the Antarctic. And Liz probably doesn't know this, but Dave wouldn't be here if I hadn't pulled him out of the hole in the sea ice that he'd fallen through. We'd gone across the frozen sea to a nearby island where Dave wanted to photograph the nesting giant skuas. He really was interested in wildlife. The skua was an oversized seagull with a disgusting culinary habits. It used to vomit all over you if you got too close. It was late in the season, so the ice was starting to melt. But you know what photographers are like. They just had to do it. Mind you, Dave might not have fallen through the ice if I hadn't agreed to take him there on my motorbike. And that's another story. So you can see why Tim found so much terrific journalistic fodder in Antarctica. It really is a very exciting place. Tim was a great friend of our association, and his books and TV series on Antarctica did much to bring the importance of the work by Inari and our members into the living rooms of Australia. He wrote a couple of great articles for our magazine. This one here's got a lovely one on climbing Big Ben, Australia's highest mountain on Heard Island. And he was very much one of our legends, along with the likes of Phil Law and several other crusty old expeditioners. Now, although he came to Antarctica later in his journalistic career, the Arctic and the Antarctic had always held great fascination for Tim. It wasn't in his blood in the same way it might have been for the great Antarctic explorers like Mawson and Wilkins and Shackleton. But it was a fascination that began in Tasmania with his grandfather, Frank Bowden. And this is a great story told by Tim with his usual flair for delight and detail. Grandfather Frank was the manager for telegraphs at the Hobart Post Office in 1912, when a dour and somewhat dishevelled foreigner came in to send a telegram. This person turned out to be Roald Amundsen, then thought to have been exploring in the Arctic, but who had secretly taken his ship, the Fram, down to Antarctica. And there, with a team of 4 men on skis and with huskies and sledges, they had made it to the South Pole, and he had raised the Norwegian flag and left a tent there. Now, you all remember that Scott was at the same time trying to do the same thing, and he had ponies and men doing man-hauling of sledges. Anyway, Amundsen had come in and he was about to send a telegram to break this news to his king in Norway and, of course, to the rest of the world. So the rest of that is history. Scott didn't make it, as we know. Amundsen became a household name, and the Fram now has its own museum in Norway. So with that family background, you'd have to be fascinated by the Antarctic. Tim was a great journalist and loved to tell a good story. The frozen ends of the earth have always been a source of good stories, and we were fortunate that Tim was there to tell stories for our generation of Antarctic explorers. Not that we were explorers by any means, I hasten to add, and heroics, apart from falling through the water, the ice, drama and privation were certainly not part of modern day life in Antarctica. But there were good stories to be told, and with his family brush with Antarctic fame, Tim was the man who wanted to tell them. In the late 1980s, Tim began to work on a series of radio documentaries based on oral history interviews with Australian expeditioners who had served down south after World War II. Then in 1989, he was able to get a berth on the Antarctic resupply ship Iceberg. And this led to his 1991 book, the ABC book, Antarctica Back in 60 Days, copy down there. As Tim says in his memoirs, the Iceberg was a vastly bigger ship than the little Dan ships. David and I went down on the Nella Dan, and it was a very small ship, really, in the scheme of things today. So the Iceberg could take much more cargo than before, and it could carry over 100 passengers. And this meant that from about 1984 onwards, people other than the expeditioners could go south on round-tripping jollies, as the Inari parlance has it. A mixed bag of artists, journalists, filmmakers, authors, politicians, and other worthies. Tim says he even had an environmental philosopher on his voyage. We all remember well the 6 half-hour documentaries called Breaking the Ice that he wrote and presented on ABC TV in 1996. For those of us who had been there, the episodes brought back so many memories, but more importantly, they helped us share those memories with family and friends who also watched the series. Tim also wrote and narrated a second documentary, The Silence Calling, in 1997, as a companion to his written official history of Inari that he had been commissioned to write in 1993 by the Australian Antarctic Division. That history, called The Silence Calling, Australians in Antarctica, 1947 to 1997, copy down there as well, was published in 1997. Tim visited Antarctica 8 times, 3 times with Inari and 6 times as guest historian on tourist voyages to the Ross Sea and the Antarctic Peninsula. He had his own memories and experiences, which Dave Pera has pulled together for me. As always, and as I mentioned a little earlier, the first polar voyage south through the roaring 40s and the furious 50s is full of expectation, but often a character-building experience. Tim's first trip was no different. Periods of interrupted sleep, punctuated by mountainous seas, screaming winds, and sometimes the thunderous roaring, snoring of one's cabin mates. But then the iceberg reaches the tranquil waters of the pack ice and the fairy tale landscape of icebergs and growlers, and often painted in a golden evening light. I must say that when I went down in the Nella Dan, the sea was absolutely horrendous, and I was flat on my back the whole time. The Nella Dan, those Dan ships, any ship's really designed to work in the ice. They've got a very shallow draft. The idea being that if they get stuck in the ice, they pop up and sit on the ice rather than get crushed and then sink when the ice goes away again. So that means they roll amazingly. They go from 90 degrees to 90 degrees. I don't know, it's just awful. So I just lay on my back for the 10 days that it took us to get through the roaring 40s. And I gave Dave Parer my Super 8 movie camera. And when eventually I got home at the end of the year and had those films developed, there's this amazing footage that Dave had taken up in the bridge of the Nella Dan. And it just shows the ship going down into the waves breaking, coming right up over the bridge of the ship, finally clearing, and you've got a bit of blue sky for a moment and then back and into it again. And Tim would have done all that. He would have been in a bigger ship, but he still would have gone through all that. Tim relished his Antarctic experience, a boy's own adventure. At Mawson, he flew east of the station by chopper to a place called Frustration Dome with a veteran diesel mechanic, David McCormack, and a woman called Lady Di Patterson, who was the first female station leader at an Australian Antarctic station. They found the remnants of a camp and broken parts of a snow track that lay in a debris field scattered across the plateau ice, the remains of a 1967 survey expedition gone wrong. Tim described how cocoa from a ruptured ration pack tasted as fresh as the day it was opened. And the Nansen sledge that the mapping team had attempted to man-haul back to the station lay encased in a snowdrift, a time capsule. And then there was his ride with the Huskies on the still frozen ice. To quote Tim, "I feel privileged to have joined the select band of people who have sledged on a Nansen sledge behind a working Husky team. The only sounds to be heard were the rasping sound of their breaths and the clatter of wooden runners over the ice. It's an experience I will never forget." I'm sure Tim would agree with me that there is no substitute for being there. It's a vast, unforgiving and beautiful land, but therein lies the conundrum. Our natural world is under enormous pressure from human activity, and Antarctica is not immune. Already the continental ice is melting, glaciers are disappearing, sea ice critical to the natural environmental cycles is not forming, habitats are threatened. In my view, most of us, more of us, need to stay home. Or if you must see Antarctica, follow Amundsen and Shackleton's lead and sail there in a wooden boat. Or better still, grab one of Tim's fabulous books or immerse yourself in his documentaries. Tim, the Inari Club salutes you. Rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I remember when Ros and Tim went down, Dad thought Mum would love it. And she liked it, but she always talked about the fear of isolation if anything happened. I think that's the mother in her. I'd like to ask Rebecca Kaiser to come up and talk. You here, Rebecca? Yes, I saw you before. Rebecca was worked at Allen and Unwin and was one of Dad's publishers for many years. Thanks, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Guy, for asking me to speak about Tim in his book life. Tim and I were friends for nearly 25 years. The first time we officially met was when we started working together on The Silence Calling, Australians in Antarctica, Tim's mammoth and magnificent history of Australia's adventurers in that last great wilderness, with the Australian Antarctic Division. Tim came into the office with a massive cache of photos and some very clear ideas about what images he wanted to use and how we should use them. Ros also came with him. And I remember her sitting there casting that, oh, don't be so silly, Tim, look, every now and then. And years later, Tim, the generous Tim, brought me back a bottle of Antarctic water with the latitude, the longitude, and the time of collection clearly labelled. I still have that bottle and the water in it. By my reckoning, Tim wrote 18 books, starting with One Crowded Hour, Neil Davis, Combat Cameraman, which is now an Australian classic. The last of his books sitting on my desk at home is his memoir of Ros. Tim and I worked together on 12 books and then various iterations of them. We talked a lot, and he regularly began our conversations with the words, "Dearest publisher, I've been thinking." And every sign-off was as Timbo. What Timbo was so often thinking about was the next project. There was always another story to be told, another oral history to share, another book to write. And always at the centre of those many books were people. History was nothing without their voices. Antarctic explorer, expeditioners, prisoners of war, outback eccentrics, larrikin soldiers, journalists, adventurers, and that included himself. Tim was as human as those he wrote about. He didn't suffer fools lightly. He harumphed often and loudly about the ways of our conservative politicians. And despite being a resolute rationalist, and this is something I can't reconcile, he was completely irrational in his dislike of sport that involved football. But he was also a fine, fair, and decent man who kept writing to the end and never lost his fascination with the lived histories of spirited Australians. For that, we thank you, Timbo.
I had a better photo for your talk, Rebecca. I apologise. I would like to ask David Brill to come up and talk about Tim and the work that they've been doing together over the last couple of years. Thank you, David.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be here in front of you all. And I think when I rang my friend and colleague Ian McIntosh and mentioned that Tim had passed and died, Ian's comment to me was, Tim was ABC royalty. And I look around this room and I see so much royalty here. Incredible journalists, broadcasters who've contributed so much to the great ABC. And all the years that I have known Tim, he was always the same. He was just so professional, so decent to the last week or so of his life. I first met Timbo, as he liked to be called, right? Certainly he liked me calling him that. It was three of us, Timbo, Davo, and Tomo, is a colleague of who I think was the publisher of One Crowded Hour, or worked on that with Tim. In 1963, when Timbo was a talks officer grade 1 in Hobart, and I was a young trainee photographer with an industrial studio, learning how to mix chemicals and framing and all that stuff before I was even allowed to go near a camera. And I met Tim through that studio because the owner put on Friday night parties. It was quite a bohemian get together, and all the ABC people turned up there. So I got to know Tim, and I was about nearly 10 years younger. And he knew that I got bullied by my boss quite a lot. And Tim understood that. He took me aside. He didn't know me, and he wasn't that much older, but he really cared about others. I can always remember that. And one day, I was fascinated by radio, and he said to me one day, he said, tomorrow morning, it was a Saturday morning, would you like to come into the ABC studios where Timbo was putting a radio documentary together? I'll show you how it's done. So there he was with the Tandberg recorder, as we talked earlier about scissors, sticky tape and a razor blade, and I just watched him do this, and the enthusiasm, but the detail of really caring of where he cut and moved and did this. Then I listened to it go to air, and it was absolutely magic, like seeing a photograph coming out of the chemicals. Just, there it is. That was 1963, and we've stayed pretty close. Off and on, we didn't see each other for a while, but there definitely was a bond there. And every now and then I'd go and have a meal opposite Gore Hill in one of the Chinese restaurants, and that's in Crow's Nest with Tim. And so we kept in contact that way. Talk about the Antarctic stuff he did. He said to me a couple of months ago, he said, do you know all that Antarctic stuff I've got on YouTube? He didn't know. And he had a look at a bit of it, and so I had a look at it with him. He used to come to Wake, he used to come to Hobart the last couple of years. And I can always remember when one of the trips, he came back from the Antarctic, and he got off the ship. They filmed this, one of those documentaries, a series, with a plastic bag of ice that he kept in the freezer on the boat, and his father was there, and they had a scotch, and he put the ice from the Antarctic in the scotch, and they went, cheers. And I thought that was a great moment. But most everything, as we had so many speakers, most everything's been said. I've ripped up my talk I was going to give because it's all pretty well been said in one way or another. But in the last 4 years, Tim and I became very, very close. And I asked Guy was right to mention about Tim's dementia. And because of Roz as well, sort of dying from it, Tim said to me, he's not going to die from dementia. He said he's had a wonderful life. But I watched the deterioration in a way at how frustrated he was getting of not being able to get things out clearly when he was talking. And it really just got worse. But he had this idea, we both did, he wanted to do a book about my 60 odd years in this business with blow-ups from a lot of my stories on one side and scripts and things on the other page. So we've been working on that for the last 4 years, off and on. And Tim's enthusiasm and his professionalism, despite not being well, a week or a day before he died, we're editing the book in Hobart, and he rang me up just to check on a word here, a word there, a caption there, just this right to the end, this sheer professionalism. And I really admired that. And he'd come down and he gave some talks. There was put on by the War Memorial, an exhibition on war cinematography. And we had an opening of it in Launceston, and Tim was the guest speaker, and he was magnificent. And the people coming up to him like he was a rock star. And he said, they just remember a bit from Backchat, he said. You know? But it wasn't that. It was that. What it was I loved about him was he was down to earth. What you saw as a person, what he was like on television, like he was on radio. To me, he was, we always say this about somebody who's passed or died, but he was a very, very special man. And I hope this book, when it comes out, obviously will be dedicated to Tim. And on a personal note, I'd like to thank Timbo for writing the book he did, particularly the one on Neil Davis, who was an exceptional human being, not just a great war cameraman, cinematographer, but a great human being. And I think that what Tim did with that book, a few of us have covered wars and conflicts and refugee camps over the years. It's made me realise, and other people realise, hopefully, that there are people like Neil Davis out there doing the hard yards with this, sometimes this very depressing work. And I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I've still got my speech here. Anyone seen my speech? I'm serious. Anyone?
No.
Anyone?
No, wouldn't be able to. Oh.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to wrap this up now, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I have thousands of stories about my dad, Tim Bowden, but I'm going to keep most of them to myself. Rossie's dementia journey was incredibly hard on Tim. He was not one to easily step into a carer's role. Since Dad's death, I've spoken to many people in the aged care realm, and they've all said that it is a select few who are suited to that role. Dad called the workers at Cullaroo, where Mum spent her last years, angels. When Ros needed to move from Woodhenge, it was extremely hard for the family. And then COVID happened. Isolation took a toll. We had many differences of opinion on all manner of things, and it was a very tough time on us all. I would like to thank Julie Blatch, who is here today, representing Sunrise Assisted Living, for looking after Tim these last years. I've spent time at Sunrise since Dad died, and the staff there loved him. Most of the residents didn't get to know him, but he did MC the occasional event, and of course he pulled out the ukulele to entertain everyone, just as he's done for many decades. I know that Tim and Ros are now together, enjoying never-ending lunches at ever-changing locations with no mower men to disturb the serenity. I've just got one last thing to play.
Nella tua fredda stanza
can't believe I was going to play that first and then try and talk. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the speakers today. That was amazing. Thank you for everyone for coming. What am I saying?
Telegram? Telegram. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just a telegram.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I've lost the speech again.
It's.
Oh, thank you.
I know.
Yeah, I couldn't find one of mine.
Sorry. Yeah.
God, do I have them? I'm all over the shop.
I'm sure they're at the last page.
Yes, sorry, I've got a couple of telegrams. Oh, goodness me, what a finale now.
I know.
Sorry, everyone. I know you want to get and talk to everyone. I've got a couple here from Dad's oldest friend, Michael Spike Bryden from down in Tassie. He writes, I was fortunate enough to move to Hobart from Sydney when I was 15 years old, and soon after was fortunate again to meet Tim. He helped me to integrate into school and all the great things that Tasmania had to offer. Great experiences were in store, among them holidays with the Bowdens at Spring Beach, an introduction to the sheer pleasure of bushwalking, with the exception of our 3 traumatic days totally lost in the southeast rainforest, an experience Tim recounting in his autobiographical book, Spooling Through. I was welcomed into the Bowden family home in Sandy Bay, and he into mine in Kingston. We shared a couple of other chaps a year in Launceston in 1963. That sounds vaguely suspect. Lots of fun and plenty of laughs. Later, Liz and I met up with Tim and Roz in New York and Charleston, South Carolina. I'll miss Tim for the rest of my days and save you my great fortune in having had such a great friend for more than 70 years. Thank you, Spike. Bill Bunbury writes, much has been said about Tim's many considerable achievements in television, etc., but his work at his work in ABC Radio National, where he created and recruited producers to set up the social history unit, which recorded the experience of so-called ordinary people. These broadcasts did not depict top-down history, but rather affect then cause, depicting the experience of men and women who endured the Great Depression of the 30s, soldiers sent to Vietnam, migrant experience, and many more in programs like Verbatim Talking History and Hindsight. He was an abiding inspiration to anyone who worked with him and learnt from him. Vale Tim with gratitude. From Ted Egan and Neris Evans, I'm not sure if you're live streaming it, Ted, to Tim, aka Timbo, aka God, aka Mr. Timothy. How I wish we could be present. I hope there is melodic singing, much raising of glasses, full to the best Australian wines only, photos and toasts, and concerning the wonderful Roz and Tim. What assets they both were to real Australia, real achievable Australia. Please mention our sadness, yet also the joy of knowing Tim and Roz. They did it so well, individually and together. And Kim Mordaunt, whose distant uncle Thomas Mordaunt wrote the poem, who contains this quote, "Sound, sound the clarion, fill the fife, throughout the sensual world proclaim, one crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. You will not be forgotten, Tim." Thank you. The bar's open and feel free to hop up, move around, and I know you all want to just talk now. So thank you again. Thanks very much for coming.
Not very much. Oh, great.